May the 22nd, 1997, Hammersmith, London. 46-year-old Andrzej Kunowski cycled home to meet his 12-year-old daughter, Katarina. It was the first time the schoolgirl had ever been home alone.
Her father tried to phone her and she wasn't answering, and he became quite worried, so he rushed back home. And when he arrived, he couldn't get into the house. He sees a pair of man's shoes underneath the door, and this causes him concern because there's somebody in his home who shouldn't be there.
He starts to bang on the door with all his might. He shoves it, he kicks it, he cannot open it. Consumed by fear, he is horrified at what could be happening to his beloved daughter.
Realizing the intruder was escaping, Andrzej chased after him and came face to face with Andrzej Kunowski, an illegal immigrant from Poland. Andrzej didn't know it, but he was looking into the eyes of his daughter's murderer.
Kunowski was a cold-blooded criminal. He had no respect for human life, he had no respect for young girls, he had no respect for the law.
Katarina's father chased after Kunowski, but the callous killer fled. A European manhunt was already in force, searching for the fugitive, who was wanted for charges of sexual assaults and rapes on women and young girls in Poland.
Kunowski was known as the Beast. Seldom has a nickname been deserved more.
He was a prolific paedophile and sexual predator who attacked vulnerable victims for almost 3 decades and would go on to take the life of a 12-year-old girl. This makes Andrzej Kunowski one of the world's most evil killers. May the 22nd, 1997, Hammersmith, West London, England. The country was in shock when news broke that a 12-year-old schoolgirl had been brutally murdered in her own home. Katarina Kunowski was followed home from school by a prolific sex offender and paedophile, 41-year-old Andrzej Kunowski.
She was beautiful, talented, promising, and to snuff out her life was an act of inconceivable brutality, a barbarity of the worst kind.
Kunowski was a wanted Polish national who'd entered the UK illegally less than 7 months before the brutal murder. He left his mark on senior investigating officer David Little.
Kunowski was actually probably one of the worst people I've ever dealt with in my time, mainly because he was so prolific.
The Met Police worked tirelessly to identify Katarina's killer. In doing so, they would also bring to justice a criminal who was wanted for a string of heinous crimes in Poland. Journalist Szymon Welostek was a young boy at the time of Kunowski's crimes in Poland.
He's still remembered in our town. He was a very dangerous criminal and an utterly depraved man. He had no regard for human life. People were there to satisfy his wild animalistic urges.
He had no remorse at all, and there was nothing could stop him basically apart from being incarcerated.
This killer's story begins in Warsaw, Poland. Andrzej Mirosław Klembert was born on March the 29th, 1956. Warsaw had suffered heavily during the Second World War, and this post-war period was a difficult time for the country. Young Andrzej didn't have the easiest of childhoods.
His parents were petty criminals. At the age of 2, he went to a foster home because both of his parents went to prison. His grandfather, we understand, was in a psychiatric ward for sexual offences as well.
He went into the institutional care system, and I think by the time he was returned to his mother, quite a lot of damage had been done.
After leaving prison, Andrzej's mother met and married builder Stefan Kunowski. Andrzej took his stepfather's surname and the family set up home in Mława, a small town 80 miles north of Warsaw. At first, family life appeared to be normal.
As a child, Kunowski was quite short, a bit overweight. He was teased by his classmates and he struggled to fit in. I think this had an impact on his psyche.
He was a bit of a mummy's boy, but he had a ferocious temper, and he used to respond to the taunts with explosions of anger and violence.
As well as a violent tendency, as he grew older, Kunowski became fascinated with local girls, which unnerved those around him.
His mother begins to sense that there's something in the adolescent Kunowski that is a little unusual. She was to say later that he developed an unhealthy appetite for sex, an unnatural sexual desire.
Age 13, he first came to the attention of the authorities for stealing.
Theft and those kind of property offences are all about a sense of entitlement. They are about wanting something and just going and taking it, regardless of the impact on others. So this is a very early warning sign for me.
As punishment, Kunowski was sent to juvenile detention.
I think it would have been a bit of a learning experience for him, but not a positive one. I think he would have been learning from his peers who had also committed offences. I think he's becoming a slightly more skilled criminal in the time that he's there.
By the age of 17, Kunowski had moved back into the family home, but soon reverted to his thieving ways and would steal money from his mother. His disturbing preoccupation with local girls had also continued.
Few people knew what the monster in their neighbourhood was hiding. Some women said there was something strange in his eyes.
He was the sort of boy that a girl would probably not look at twice. But at the age of 17, he clearly felt some kind of profound sexual urge and decides to attack a neighbour's 16-year-old daughter. He drags her into the bushes and rapes her.
This is a very early age to be committing this kind of offence, and it's very important that we realise that you don't go from a healthy individual one day with normal psychological functioning to a rapist the next. There would have been an escalation of behaviour.
The 16-year-old victim was able to identify her neighbour, Kunowski, as her rapist. 2 other local girls also came forward, having been attacked in similar circumstances, and one of these was added to the indictment against Kunowski. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. It would be the first rape conviction of many.
In 1976, he's released from prison. He's now 20. He's spruced himself up a bit, given to dressing quite well.
He also earned the nickname of the Little Doctor, which involved his rather exaggerated habit of clicking his heels and slightly bowing whenever he met someone.
But don't let anyone be fooled by that. This is a man who has nothing in mind but rape. Within a month, who commits the next attack. This time, it's a 24-year-old woman.
Kunowski was apprehended and returned to prison for another 9 months for the rape. However, it was only a temporary respite for the community.
He was only sentenced to 9 months imprisonment. A young man who's already served 3 years in prison for rape. Was that not taken into account? Was there no suggestion that perhaps we have the beginnings of a serial rapist on our hands?
Once again, prison time didn't curb the devious sexual desires in Kunowski. Instead, it only seemed to ignite them, and the 22-year-old went on to attack more women and young girls in the area.
In 1978, he committed rapes in June, July, August, September, October and November. Sometimes, on one occasion, up to 4 rapes in a month. He was totally prolific and probably felt he was untouchable.
Kunowski would typically attack a woman and then choke her. He had a specific method to lure his victims in. First, he would call out to a woman from his car, and as she'd approach him and lean in, he would wind up the window, trapping her. He would then approach her from behind and very brutally rape her. His victims were extremely intimidated and later couldn't remember his face, which shows just how brutal and how aggressive this monster, the beast from Mława, was.
By the end of 1978, Kunowski had brutally attacked at least 24 victims. On the 22nd of December, he forced a girl into a cellar, holding a razor to her ear before raping her. She was just 11 years old.
Kunowski's record is one of escalation. As he grows older, with more experience of how he can get away with these attacks and the better opportunities he can spot for these attacks. And it also reflects his mounting lust. It's an escalating graph of him getting more and more and more dangerous.
In January 1979, his reign of terror halted when authorities convicted Kunowski for some of the rapes he'd committed during the previous year. But being behind bars in a male prison still didn't stop him offending.
He was a very prolific sex offender. He had also raped his cellmate in prison. He had no remorse whatsoever.
In April 1979, Kunowski was almost 3 months into a sentence at Warszawa Wola detention prison, Poland, for a series of brutal rapes on young girls and women. Bored of prison life, Kunowski didn't intend to stay behind bars. He was planning a great escape.
Kunowski is in prison and decides that he wishes not to be and saws through the bars of his cell to get out. It almost defies belief. I mean, here is a serial rapist who seems to be able to escape at will. Needless to say, no sooner has he done so than he rapes again.
On the 8th of May 1979, police intercepted him 85 miles away in the city of Łódź. Desperate to avoid rearrest, Kunowski took a young girl hostage with an axe. After a tense standoff, police succeeded in bringing him back into custody. And after 3 months, he was transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Pruszków. But once again, he managed to free himself.
He saws through the bars of the psychiatric hospital and breaks out.
Kunowski stole 2 cars and fled across the country, but he was eventually pursued by the police and crashed one of the stolen cars into a house near Jałdów. He was immediately arrested and taken back into custody on the morning of August the 24th, 1979. There he awaited trial.
Prison is just a bit of a revolving door for him at this point in his life. When he's spending time in prison, he's learning from other people, he's ruminating, he's fantasizing, he's planning his next attack, because that's all that matters to him.
Authorities took a tougher stance in 1980 when Kunowski was faced with over 70 charges, predominantly for sex offences and rape against women and children. The litany of charges also included escape from a police convoy and attempted murder.
Finally, his crimes catch up with him and is effectively sentenced to 15 years imprisonment.
On hearing the verdict, the prosecutor, Waldemar Smarzewski, said he'd hoped to separate Kunowski from society for longer, as he was certain he would go on to rape again, perhaps even start killing. 5 years later, an additional 15 years were added in recognition of the brutality Kunowski had shown to one of his young victims. Kunowski was now facing 30 years behind bars.
At this point in Poland's history, their prisons are massively overcrowded. The actual conditions in these prisons would have been absolutely horrendous.
Kunowski was desperate to get out and wrote to the Polish authorities.
He claimed that his cellmates treated him badly. that they humiliated him psychologically and physically, that he was beaten. At some point, his teeth got knocked out. Kunowski complains that he had his throat slit.
While Kunowski's letters had no effect, a momentous announcement by the Polish Parliament in 1989 would have a significant impact on the 33-year-old's future. To mark the end of communism, an Amnesty Act was passed, which resulted in the reduction of prison sentences. Kunowski used this to his advantage. On the 17th of January 1990, the court in Olsztyn delivered a decision allowing him to be considered for parole. He walked free the following year after demonstrating good behaviour.
There was an absolute failure on the part of the Polish criminal justice system because he was a serial offender. And when somebody is constantly making that decision time and time again to harm other people, they're not going to simply decide to stop one day.
Despite his criminal background, Kunowski's family were keen to help their son get back on his feet.
With the help of his family, he bought himself a delivery van, and he was living in a flat which his parents bought him on Tuwima Street in Mława. Kunowski started trading at the local market. There he met a woman who would become his future partner. What the woman has in common with his victims is a considerable age difference. She was 10 years his junior. They would go on to have a daughter together.
However, despite setting up home with his partner and her 6-year-old son, Kunowski still couldn't contain his devious and aggressive behaviour and continued to prey upon vulnerable women without his partner's knowledge. She soon became aware of his violent tendencies.
Eventually, he attacks her, and also, for good measure, he attacks her son. Trying to be someone conventional and respectable simply doesn't suit Kunowski's character. Underneath that polished exterior is a poisonous toad of a little man who thinks nothing of destroying women and any woman he may come across.
The relationship broke down and Kunowski's partner left him. She would soon discover she was pregnant and vowed to protect the child, a baby girl, from him. Meanwhile, Kunowski had become obsessed with a new type of victim, so-called latchkey children.
At this point in his offending history, he begins to target young girls who are home alone, latchkey children. Their mum, their dad might be out at work and they are in the house on their own. Now, this is really significant for me because he's starting to engage in some kind of stalking behaviour. And so this does suggest to me that his offending is becoming more sophisticated and he's becoming a lot more dangerous.
Soon, reports of school children being attacked spread in and around the county of Mława, and as far away as Warsaw. Parents were terrified of leaving their children alone.
At the time, I was in primary school. My classmates and I were accompanied to the nearby school by our parents or grandparents. Where we were allowed to go was restricted. At that time, I didn't know his name. I just knew that he was an older man. We were told that if we saw a man acting strange, we should scream and go straight home.
In 1992, Kunowski continued to prey on vulnerable children in both Mława and Warsaw. Despite being arrested several times, by 1995 he was free to resume his attacks on young girls, targeting an 11-year-old in February and abducting another in March. On May the 16th that year, he struck again.
Kunowski is on the streets of Warsaw and once again targets a young girl coming back from school. He watches her, sees that she lets herself in to her flat with a latchkey. There doesn't appear to be anyone in except her. He knocks on the door, forces his way in, and then engages her in a conversation which is bizarre, to say the least, in which, "Can you keep a secret?" he says to her. She's obviously slightly bewildered by all this. And then he asks her to kiss him. And then, of course, he starts to suffocate her. He pulls her blouse over her head and he attacks her.
Kunowski then fled the scene and the 10-year-old girl bravely raised the alarm.
She shouts, screams after him, and he is, in fact, caught.
Linking other similar crimes in the area, the police were able to put Kunowski on trial. The primary charge was rape of an 11-year-old girl. There was great interest from the local media.
Journalists named Kunowski the Beast from Mława, a very appropriate description when it comes to Kunowski.
It seemed that justice would finally be served. However, there was to be a twist of fate.
Kunowski pulls one of the great stunts. He persuades the prison authorities that he's got a very sore left hip and that it very badly inhibits his movement. It is complete and utter balderdash. But nevertheless, the little doctor is quite convincing.
In June 1996, he was actually released from prison on 3 months parole in order to get a hip operation, and he was left free to go and sort it out for himself.
The man named the Beast never did have his operation. Instead, he embarked on a 1,000-mile trip. He was London-bound.
I think Kunowski reaches the point where he realises he needs a blank slate. So I think there is that urge in him to start somewhere else and to start looking for a new victim pool.
In his last years in Poland, the press had taken to giving him a nickname, the Beast. Well, the Beast had arrived in England, and it was only a matter of time before he would strike again.
He arrived in October 1996 at Victoria Station. From that moment on, he just disappeared into the UK. As an illegal immigrant, he was totally below the radar, and because of that, his DNA was not taken, his fingerprints were not taken. We had no knowledge of who Kunowski was.
At that time, there was tens of thousands of European people arriving. It was impossible for the authorities to keep track of this, and very easy for Kunowski to disappear into the subculture of London, where jobs are paid cash in hand, where rent is paid cash in hand, and no questions are asked.
The fact that he is an illegal immigrant with a disgusting record of crime in his native Poland is known to no one.
It's difficult to imagine Kunowski could even have stood out in the crowd. He was just an everyday bloke in the street, and in the accommodation in which he flitted between in various bedsits and flats, people were coming and going. It was a perfect cover for him to get up to what he wanted to do and to resume his attacks on women.
Just 7 months after arriving in the UK, Kunowski's perverse desire for attacking children was once again ignited. He was on the prowl for another victim, and the 41-year-old reverted to a familiar MO, following so-called latchkey children home from school in the knowledge that they would be alone. And it wasn't long before he struck again.
Kunowski had spotted Katarina Koneva. I suspect that he did his homework and that he knew that she left school and would arrive back at her flat in Hammersmith.
Katarina was a 12-year-old girl who had come over from Macedonia with both of her parents, Traj and Jackie, and her younger brother. She was studying at Holland Park School. She was well-liked. She was a bubbly young girl. Her family were here to learn English, to escape from Macedonia effectively. They wanted a better life.
On May the 22nd, 1997, as Katarina made her way home from school, she couldn't know she was being followed.
This is very similar to the offence that we know of in Poland. So this would have been planned because this would have involved some kind of stalking. And I've heard stalking described as murder in slow motion, and that's exactly what it is in this case.
When the 12-year-old arrived at her flat, Kunowski was close behind. In a twist of fate, this was the first time Katarina had ever been home alone.
Her dad should have been at home, but unfortunately he was delayed at his English lessons, and so he was late. Katarina went home from school as normal, let herself in, and we assume that Kunowski knocked on her door. There was no sign of forced entry at all, and the door was locked internally after he'd entered the house.
I think she would have opened the door. She was a trusting young girl. What she was doing, however, was letting in a monster. He takes her into the living room of the flat and barricades the door with a chair.
From that moment inside the flat, what happened between killer and victim, only the killer knows. But he clearly had grabbed her and began to choke her with a cord he found to hand, pushing her down and choking her at the same time as he attacked her. She must have been screaming, but in a flat at that time of the day, no one could hear it.
At some point, Katarina's father, Traj, had returned home, but the door was locked from the inside and Katarina did not answer. Becoming concerned, Traj looked through the letterbox.
He saw Katarina lying on the floor. He then saw beneath the door, basically he describes as 2 black shoes. He then obviously realised that something was wrong.
He's horrified. He starts to bang on the door with all his might. He shoves it, he kicks it. He cannot open it. Consumed by fear, he is horrified at what could be happening to his beloved daughter.
Whilst that was happening, he became aware that the person inside had moved to the front of the house, effectively, and naturally assumed that the person was leaving by the first floor window. So he ran downstairs and out to the front and saw Kunowski actually coming out of the window and land in the front garden. He then confronted Kunowski, who just basically stared at him.
Getting his first look at the intruder, Traj noticed a spot of blood on his face. As Kunowski fled the scene, Traj had only a split second to plan his next move. His instinct was to chase after him.
As they went down the street, Kunowski turned and shouted to passers-by, "Help me, help me." And 2 workmen could see that something was happening here and decided to intervene.
He's actually making out that he's the victim, that somebody's after him, and passers-by in the streets basically help him.
The well-meaning members of the public held Traj back, allowing Kunowski to get a head start. Traj managed to break free and continued the pursuit. The chase came to an abrupt halt when Kunowski pulled out a knife. Surrendering, Traj rushed back to check on his daughter.
After Kunowski had run away from Traj, he wanted to get away from the scene of crime as fast as he possibly could. There was a young lady driving her car down the street at the time. He stopped in front of her and threatened her with a knife and made her get out of her car.
He sped off in the hijacked vehicle before abandoning it half a mile away on Shepherd's Bush Road. He then boarded a bus destined for Hammersmith Broadway.
He gets off the bus and disappears into the crowd. Once again, in the wind, beneath the radar.
With Kunowski on the run, Traj had made it back to his flat. The scene behind the door would devastate his family's life forever.
When he came back, he had to break the door down to get in, past the barricades that Kunowski had across the door, and there found his daughter with this cord so tight around her neck, lying on the floor. He was trying desperately to pull at this cord, and he couldn't manage it, so he went to the kitchen to get a kitchen knife to try and cut it open.
He was screaming for help, obviously, and one of the neighbours went to help him. Police were called.
And by the time they arrived, he was desperately trying to revive her. Paramedics took over, but without any success.
Katarina had been murdered. The cause of the 12-year-old's death was strangulation. The police needed to act fast to find the culprit.
Most killings happen in a domestic scene, and often it's the last person or the person there who turns out to be the killer.
Unfortunately, Traj has to be considered as a suspect and was being questioned as such.
The first time his wife finds him, he is a prisoner. Her daughter is dead, and her husband is accused of killing her. The impact on her must have been devastating.
With no witnesses to the murder itself, police appealed to the local community for information. 7 people would come forward having witnessed the chase, but their evidence had flaws. A number of the witnesses had assumed that Kunowski was actually a victim being chased, and so descriptions of him became muddled with descriptions of Traj. The police were no closer to catching the actual killer. Whilst police artists worked to produce a composite sketch of the man seen running away, detectives had a stroke of luck when a local builder's yard checked their security camera.
There is CCTV evidence of the 2 running past an alleyway, first Kunowski and then obviously being chased by Traj.
The CCTV proved Traj's claims that he had chased an intruder away from his home. At the murder scene, forensic teams found 2 significant clues.
One was a fingerprint on the windowsill, which did not belong to any member of the family. The other was a single hair on a cardigan of Katarina's.
But there was one major obstacle.
Kunowski's fingerprints weren't on file anywhere in Britain, and so any conventional method of trying to find the offender using either fingerprints or DNA wasn't available. Kunowski was a ghost.
Detectives working to create a profile of the murderer couldn't begin to guess the true depravity of this killer or how widespread his crimes were.
It was inevitable that Kunowski was going to kill because he enjoyed the feelings of power. He felt that he was entitled to do what he wanted with his victims.
Once again, Kunowski was at large. The killer moved towards the West Midlands, seeking employment in fruit farms. But he soon went back to his thieving ways.
It wasn't long before he had his fingers in the till and he was arrested for stealing from his employer. He clearly thought he was bulletproof.
When police examined Kunowski's forged passport, they discovered his visa had expired and he was detained in Oxfordshire on immigration offences. The murder of Katarina 1 month earlier still remained unsolved. And whilst forensic evidence had been taken from the murder scene, there was no match on the national DNA database. Immigration officials didn't know they had a killer in custody, and the killer had no intention of waiting to be caught.
Had the law at that time allowed the immigration authorities to take a DNA sample from someone they suspected was an illegal immigrant, they would have been able to say to the police in Hammersmith that the man they had in their custody was actually the man who had murdered Katarina.
Unaware that they had a killer in custody, immigration authorities granted Kunowski temporary release whilst his case was being considered.
He was in need of a new identity. So when he was released from the detention centre, he managed to procure a fake Portuguese passport. And of course, again, it put another distance between himself and his criminal past.
In September 1997, Kunowski's application was turned down and he appealed. The serial escapee had no intention of returning for his immigration hearing. By the time the appeal was rejected in December 1997, he had disappeared. He would live life under the radar for the next 4 years.
I have no idea where he was for those years. He was using aliases. He may have been arrested and dealt with under another name somewhere else, totally different. But I find it inconceivable that he's not committed other offences.
In 2001, 4 years after the brutal killing of Katarina, Kunowski had made his way back to West London.
Kunowski's brass neck knew no bounds. He even registers with the NHS under his assumed name of De Diaz for a heart bypass operation. It's breathtaking audacity.
The following year, after a period of recuperation, the beast was fighting fit and back on the streets of West London.
Now he's living in a room in Acton, working part-time as a tailor, little odd jobs here and there, and yet again targeting vulnerable young women. At one point, he's hovering outside Ealing Broadway Underground Station, and he spies a young Korean woman, 21, looking at a board which has advertisements for rooms to let.
He went up to her, offered her assistance, told her that he would help her find somewhere to live. She'd not long been in the country and her English was actually very stilted. So he offered to take her back to where he was staying, his bedsit, and help her find accommodation.
When Kunowski decided to lure this student back to his flat, I think there was an intention to kill, because he'd killed before. I think he'd enjoyed killing before. He'd gotten away with it before. So I think there was a real arrogance in him at this point in time.
Once he got her to her bedsit, he overpowered her, tied her up, and raped her.
Kunowski was now at the height of his brutality as an experienced sexual predator and brutal in his aggression against women. And he attacked this Korean student with a frenzy.
To actually be taken, tied up in somebody else's home and then raped is a horrendous ordeal. She was a stranger to the country. She'd not long been in this country. She thought she'd been befriended by somebody who was going to help her. He abused that trust. He abused her.
During the 3-hour ordeal, the defenceless student's survival instincts kicked in.
This young woman, she was very smart. She was able to basically talk her way out of it. But she was able to say to him, well, it's okay, I'll call you tomorrow, or I want to see you again. So she was appealing to a kind of inherent narcissism within him, and it saved her life. It was an incredibly brave thing to do.
Kunowski, in his vanity and arrogance, thought that would be all right and that she would actually phone him the following day. The young Korean woman goes straight to the police. For the first time, Kunowski's made a real blunder.
By committing the offence in his own flat, Kunowski had effectively led police to his front door. However, the police still had no idea this was Katarina's killer. In May 2003, he was convicted of the rape and received 9 years imprisonment at HMP Belmarsh. When officials took Kunowski's DNA, it sparked some interesting developments.
A number of things have happened. His DNA is on file, his fingerprints are on file. The review of Katarina's killing is initiated, and lo and behold, the DNA matches.
The most damning DNA evidence was the DNA on the hair on Katarina's cardigan, and also a fingerprint as Kunowski jumped out of the window. Both of those are irrefutable, absolute pieces of evidence.
When the Met found that they had not just a rapist but a significant murderer in a case that hadn't been able to solve for 6 years, they then checked international files, and suddenly it flashed up to the astonishment of the London detectives that Kunowski had this massive record for 2 decades of attacks in Poland.
The Polish authorities were very helpful with their assistance, and the DNA proved that he'd committed offences in Poland as well.
The trial for the murder of Katarina Kuneva began at the Old Bailey in March 2004. Both senior investigating officer David Little and court correspondent Paul Cheston witnessed the proceedings.
It was a very emotional trial because the family, both Traj and Jackie, were obviously very upset at what had happened.
Tragedy on this nature, particularly violent murder in a family, often has the most destructive effect. They almost turned on themselves in a way, and Katarina's mother and father split up.
Unfortunately, in every case where a child or anybody has been murdered, the family assume a degree of guilt absolutely incorrectly. Traj expected to be home before he was. Jackie expected Traj to be home for their daughter arriving home. Between the two of them, they both harboured a degree of guilt for what had happened.
Traj was face to face with his daughter's killer once again. But this time he had to give evidence of that fateful day and the heartbreaking decision he made.
The moment that had the most impact on me was just how he explained how he stumbled across this attack on his own daughter in his own flat and was confronted with the two-horn dilemma of chase the attacker or tend to his stricken daughter. And that was explained in his own words through a whole veil of tears in his eyes and choking in his throat. It was heart-rending evidence from the witness box.
The heartless killer Kunowski appeared unmoved.
When Kunowski was in the dock at court, he showed no remorse. He just stayed there, listened to the evidence totally without any emotion whatsoever.
It took the jury of 4 women and 8 men less than 3 hours to decide. Kunowski was found guilty of Katarina's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment by the Common Sergeant of London, Judge Peter Beaumont, QC.
Sentencing Kunowski for the murder of Katarina, the judge said, and I quote, "You took the life of a child who was just beginning to enjoy what this country had to offer. It was a life of great promise, and you ended it in circumstances of great violence and terror."
Kunowski's sentence was bittersweet for Katarina's parents.
They'd lost their daughter, a 12-year-old girl. At the time of the conviction, Traj felt there was closure and it had been dealt with. Jackie didn't. She felt cheated. She just felt that nothing could be done to make amends for what he'd done.
Whilst Kunowski began his sentence at HMP Frankland, Europe's media descended on the small village of Mława.
In Poland, Kunowski's mother is naturally approached by the media, and she confesses that she never thought he was entirely normal, but refuses to accept that he actually is a monster.
Kunowski wasn't in prison for long. 5 years into his life sentence, he died of heart failure in the Durham prison, age 53.
When we discovered that Kunowski had died in prison, the first thing we did was to go and tell the families. And I do know that Jackie felt cheated by his death. She wanted him to burn in hell, as she said. She did feel that he'd got the easy way out.
Even after his death, countless victims are still living a life sentence imposed by him.
This kind of experience had an impact on these people. It changed their life and behaviour entirely.
He continually offended whilst he was at large, and I am certain he must have committed other offences.
We cannot know how dangerous Kunowski was. This was literally a predator on the loose. He could have committed literally hundreds of attacks, and we shall never ever know for sure.
He was a prolific sex offender and paedophile who caused torment and fear across Europe for almost 3 decades, before taking the life of a bright young girl who had her whole future ahead of her. He showed no remorse for any of his actions, and that's what makes Andrzej Kunowski one of the world's most evil killers.